I'm Andrew Tuck and you're listening to The Urbanist on Monocle 24, the show all about the cities we live in. Coming up in this week's programme...
Well, I would think if you read Monocle and follow this radio program, you know what the new urban crisis is.
From gentrification to unaffordability, how do you fix a city in crisis? We speak with the renowned urban thinker Richard Florida about his new book and how to devise a new model of urbanism that works for everyone. Also ahead...
Paris has always conjured up a fairly specific set of images. The Eiffel Tower, the Champs-Élysées, the Arc de Triomphe. A chugging choo-choo train is not one of them.
We're in Paris to look at the mayor's plans to redevelop an abandoned railway and what impact it will have on the city. That's all coming up over the next 30 minutes, right here on The Urbanist with me, Andrew Tuck. Stay tuned. And we start today's programme in France. If there's one thing that's coveted in Paris, it's peace and tranquility. The constant rush of traffic, the high concentration of pedestrians, means that getting a moment of calm is something of a luxury. That's why news that Paris Mayor Anne Hidalgo plans to redevelop 10 kilometres of La Petite Santerre, the city's abandoned railway, has many wondering if these efforts will be used for good or bad. Will the project boost the area's precious biodiversity or destroy it in favour of economic prosperity? Well, Monocle contributor Colette Davidson has been finding out in Paris.
Paris has always conjured up a fairly specific set of images. The Eiffel Tower, the Champs-Élysées, the Arc de Triomphe. A chugging choo-choo train is not one of them. But alas, there was a time when trains were vital to Parisian life. In the late 1800s, La Petite Ceinture Railway was created as a 32-kilometer loop around the city as a way to transport people and merchandise, protect the city militarily, and create jobs. But with the construction of the city's metro system came the decline of railway transport, and little by little, La Petite Ceinture fell into disuse. By the late 1900s, the railway had become nearly obsolete. Recently, the abandoned tracks have become a political sticking point, with the city working to develop the railway and bring economic prosperity to the area, and others arguing that in doing so, a wealth of plant and animal life will be destroyed. News that Paris Mayor Anne Hidalgo has plans to open 10 kilometers of La Petite Ceinture to the public by 2020 has rustled up an ongoing debate. The development of La Petite Ceinture is already underway. So far, 3.5 kilometers of tracks are available to the public. For entrepreneurs and the average Parisian, the changes to La Petite Ceinture have been a positive thing for the city. The 18th arrondissement in the north of the city boasts several brush-ups to the railways. Perched on a bridge high over the tracks is La Recyclerie, a hybrid cafe, urban farm, and community center offering classes on recycling, meals made with whole foods, and even its own chicken coop. Down the way is Le Grand Train, an enormous swath of land and abandoned tracks that have been transformed into a concert space, multi-room restaurant, and museum. Visitors can hop on a host of stationary trains that were once used on the Petite Ceinture and imagine the way things were. Plans to develop the rest of the long-forgotten railway system are sure to remain in this vein, combining a recognition of the tracks and a celebration of biodiversity. There are several projects in the running for upcoming uses of La Petite Ceinture, many of them coming from a participatory budget, a competition of sorts where citizens can suggest ideas for how to use city spaces. But plenty of people aren't so happy about what's become of this Parisian relic. Many residents near the tracks are privy to fox sightings and unique plant and animal life. Rare in an urban landscape, these are things that may disappear as developers enter the city with bulldozers and cement trucks, even if their intentions are good. The tracks are also an unofficial meeting grounds for street artists, who have already lined parts of the expanse with intricate murals and graffiti. For some of the city's homeless, La Petite Ceinture is a place to find solitude and a space to lay their heads. It is also home to several unofficial entry points to the Paris catacombs, boasting a collection of secret passageways beneath the city. But none of this has been enough to sway the city, which sees La Petite Ceinture as an opportunity too juicy to leave by the wayside. And with Mayor Hidalgo's mission to create more green spaces in the city, get rid of diesel cars and bring more electric bikes and cars to the people, one surely hopes that the future of La Petite Ceinture will be bright. For Monocle in Paris, I'm Colette Davidson.
After this, we're going to bring you a special interview with one of the world's leading urbanists, Richard Florida.
Are you fed up with the white noise that often passes for news coverage? Do you want something more than soundbite journalism when it comes to the big issues of the day? Then join Monocle's editors and guests for The View from Midori House. Informed analysis, serious debate, and lively discussion. Every weekday at 1800 London time, tune in to Midori House on Monocle 24.
You're listening to The Urbanist on Monocle 24. I'm Andrew Tuck. In his latest book, The New Urban Crisis, the renowned urbanist Richard Florida argues that the influx of young people back to urban centres 2 decades ago, celebrated at the time, has contributed to a simmering crisis in our cities. The book tackles the divide between suburb and city to the increasing wealth gap that's become a hallmark of urban life around the world today. Richard stopped by our Toronto bureau to speak with Monocle's Thomas Lewis.
Well, I would think if you read Monocle and follow this radio program, you know what the new urban crisis is. It really is the central crisis of our time. And, whether you live in London or New York, Toronto, where we're talking today, San Francisco, Paris. I mean, I could go on. Shanghai, Beijing, Seoul, Tokyo. If you live in one of these great urban centers, certainly over the past couple of decades, you have seen housing prices escalate in a way, there were always expensive areas, but escalate in a way that no one could have expected. And, not just in London or in New York or in Tokyo, but in Vancouver, Canada, which is now on a housing cost to income basis, the third least affordable city in the world after Hong Kong and Sydney. Toronto, which was a quaint little parochial town 2 decades ago, is now the 9th most, I'm shocked to say this, on, again, looking at housing costs in relation to the income people earn. More expensive on that basis than New York because people earn more. So the new urban crisis is really a crisis of the attractiveness of these great centers, in many ways a crisis of success. But at the same time, we've not only seen, and many, many great thinkers and political leaders and mayors, whether that's Bill de Blasio in New York or Sadiq Khan in London or Anne Hidalgo in Paris, have talked about the Great Divide. De Blasio calls it a tale of two cities. But really, it's not just economic inequality. We now, in our cities and metropolitan areas, have seen the absolute middle and these old middle-class neighborhoods, which were the platforms of success and mobility and building a great life. We've seen them literally eviscerated, and our cities have become small little areas of kind of concentrated wealth and advantage for the global super rich, for knowledge workers, the members of my own creative class. It's not just the 1%, it's about a third of us who can make a go. But then the other 2/3, falling further and further behind and surrounding these areas of concentrated advantage, much larger spans of concentrated disadvantage. And those are not only in the city, but what's so interesting about the new urban crisis, that's spread out to what we used to think of as the great affluent suburbs. So it really is a new geographic divide in our society. And that divide is not only causing inequality, it's causing this terrible backlash. In Toronto, we saw that with the rise of the dysfunctional crack mayor, Rob Ford. In England, we saw that with the Brexit. Of course, in the United States, we saw that most recently with the rise of Donald Trump.
We'll come to the sort of the bigger political stories, I suppose, and where they fit into an urbanist's narrative. But isn't this the trajectory, the path, the narrative you've just sort of outlined? Isn't that a path that big cities, have been on, since cities were born? Neighbourhoods come, neighbourhoods go, prices go up, prices go down. Why is now different, do you think?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. Cities are these living organisms. They grow, they decline, they're up, they're down. Neighborhoods come, they go. Jane Jacobs, who became a mentor and a great friend of mine, the greatest urbanist of all of us. When I moved to Toronto a decade ago and Jane was still here, I asked her the same question. And I asked her particularly about New York City, Soho, and the Village, where she lived on Hudson Street. And she looked and she kind of smiled at me. And she said, cities are made by, Richard, you call them creative people. They're made by creative people, artists and musicians and working people. They're made by people. And she said, when a place gets boring, even the rich people leave. She just had remarkable insights. So the other insight, of course, new ideas require old buildings, old repurposable spaces. I think what's happened in the past decade and a half, since the year 2000, is different, though. Yes, London was expensive always, but if you were a working person, you could live in an area of London. If you were a musician, a rock and roller, a punk, a new waver, if you were an artist, you could find a space. New York, I grew up in Newark, New Jersey, but New York, when I was a boy, in my early studies, walking around the city, there were artists literally squatting, illegally squatting in buildings in Soho. There was a vibrant music scene, an artistic scene. And we could go on. These are just the most... When I moved to Toronto, middle-class people could afford to live in Toronto. Now, I think what we've seen, beginning in the year 2000, now that we actually have the data to look at this, beginning in the year 2000, something different began to happen. And I wrote Rise of the Creative Class at this time, and I was kind of hopefully optimistic that these second and third cities like Pittsburgh and Cleveland, Hamilton, Ontario, Birmingham, Leeds, I could go on. These second and third tier cities would get with it and come back. I think I was shocked when you really looked at the data from 2000 to, say, 2015. What's happened with the urban revival. So a couple things. One, the global super rich. I talk about how when I go to London, every time my driver invariably takes me by this same building fronting Hyde Park, this glass building, and says, look at that building. The flats go for 20 million or 50 million pounds, and no one actually lives there. They're all dark. You go on 57th Street in New York, Billionaires Row, and you see the same thing. But let's even give a bigger purview. It's not just the super rich. And it's not just people looking at buildings as a way to stash or launder money, which is happening, of course, in the great cities. What's happening is that the truly affluent have decided they want to be in these cities. So they're leaving the suburbs. They're coming back. Older people, baby boomers. The tech companies that used to be out in the suburban hinterland in a Silicon Valley office park, a so-called Nerdistan. I looked at the data last night. Silicon Valley, which used to be the epicenter of worldwide high technology, this is just the U.S. metropolitan areas, is now fourth. The city of San Francisco is number one with its urban center. New York is number two, ahead of Silicon Valley, and Boston is number three. So these high-tech companies have poured, and London would be another example of this, a place which had finance and entertainment and media, movie making and music, but never had technology companies. Now around Shoreditch in the East End has become a technology boomtown. The creative class, the artists, the art and the service. Maybe the creatives are getting pushed out, but the art galleries and all of the business and commerce. So everyone is trying to cram themselves into this very small area. I call it in the book the great paradox of land. We have so much space in the world. In the United States, only 6% of land across that entire country is developed. In Canada, 80% of the population is crammed into 2% of the land area. But everyone wants to jam themselves into little slivers of central London or little slivers of central San Francisco or little parts of lower Manhattan. And that's driving the cost through the roof. So I think the point is cities have always been these centers of creativity and commerce and open-mindedness. It's just that now, because the central force of economic growth isn't knowledge, just knowledge. It isn't just technology. It isn't just human capital. It's really the clustering of knowledge and talent and technology and human capital in great centers, urban neighborhoods. Those have become so contested over, so competed for, that the prices have gone through the roof. And that's what's happening. In that sense, this very clustering force which drives our economy, which makes us innovative, which propels creativity, is now, in a sense, ripping us and tearing us apart.
So if people are now flocking to, say, urban centres, pushing other sectors of people out, how does the ebb and flow of that tide, how has that played out from the research and the writing in your book? If tech companies were on the outskirts of a city and are now bang in the middle of it, if artists were bang in the middle of it and now they're out somewhere else, is there an enrichment process happening in those other areas? Or is it your view from the book that actually everyone's kind of a loser in a way?
Well, I think the comeback of the cities and the urban revival is a fantastic thing, that I and Jane Jacobs and many other people wished for. But I think up until recently, there was an optimism that this back to the city movement would lift many boats, perhaps quite naive, that because people weren't coming back en masse. The cities were dying. There was the proverbial, what we called in the United States, the hole in the donut. I think there was this optimism. And if I look at the writing in urban affairs, there is a whole group of urban optimists, and not just me. Edward Glaser, the great professor at Harvard, Ricky Burdett at the London School of Economics, Bruce Katz at the Brookings Institution, and many others. So optimistic. And I'm a person of the left. I came up a kind of neo-Marxian urbanist. But then there are a lot of left-leaning urbanists who have been cautioning the great David Harvey, saying, we're seeing this gentrification and corporate takeover. Mike Davis, the LA-based writer, writing about the transformation of LA. And in this book, it's been very hard for me. I try to reconcile these two competing schools, the urban optimists and the urban pessimists. And I actually ask a question in the book. I say something like, is it true that cities are the engines of economic growth? Is it the case that cities are the fonts of innovation? Is it the case that also cities are where tolerance and civil progress and social decency, the centers of civilization? But is it also the case that cities are increasingly divided, that cities are the centers of inequality, that cities are, these hyper-gentrified places? And the answer to all those questions is yes. And I think that's what this book tries to reconcile, that cities are both the source of progress and the source of division, and left to their own devices, they will not heal themselves. But I think, on balance, the comeback of cities is a good thing. But what we've ended up with, the market left to its own devices, without policies and institutions that can mitigate this clustering force, which is so powerful. I say in the book, we've come to this era of winner-take-all urbanism. We know what a winner-take-all economy is, but now we have winner-take-all urbanism, where the great winner cities like London, New York, San Francisco, Paris, capturing so much of the talent, so much of the commerce, so much of the investment, so much of the innovation. We get this geographic inequality. Other cities fall further and further and further behind. But also I make the case in the book is that the winners also experience their own crisis, in part a crisis of success, a part a crisis of negligence, where it's only increasingly the wealthy, the advantaged third that can afford to live in them, with the middle class falling apart and the less advantaged service workers and disadvantaged people falling further behind. So the book is a call really for a new urban agenda. I think the hard part here is that it would be wonderful if we had a national urban policy. But with Trump in control of the United States and with the conservatives' control in the United Kingdom and with this populist movement, which is really an anti-urbanist, it's really give me back my country and reimpose family kind of suburban or rural values. Maybe in Canada with Trudeau you can get some traction, but really what's so daunting about this is there won't be in most places there will not be a national urban strategy to invest in housing, invest in affordable housing, make transit better to connect places. So cities and metro areas, or what I call the mega regions, these areas like the Boston, New York, Washington corridor, conglomerations of various cities and metros are going to have to do it on their own. And I think that's been the big wake-up call for me. The rise of populism and Trumpism mean that we're not going to have a national agenda for cities and urbanism. In a way, we're going to have to do it ourselves, which is these are big problems and they're hard problems. They're terribly difficult problems. Cities and metro areas, communities, cities and suburbs are going to have to begin to solve them on their own.
Is solving the problem on one's own in principle, though, necessarily a bad thing? We've drawn comparisons between London, New York, Toronto, but ultimately each of those cities are very, very different places, very, very different, makeup socially, economically. How difficult is it for, a city hall or a provincial government, say here in Ontario, or, a state government in the United States? Is there a recipe for the sort of balance of intervening or to let a city get on with it and to let, say individuals, urbanists, entrepreneurs, artists, they chip in their ideas and the city sort of garners its identity from that? How tricky is that balance within this urban crisis as you describe it?
I think you've got to the nub of it. When I was writing this book over the past, believe it or not, 7 years, all the while, President Obama was president in the United States, and I assumed, like many others, given my own biases, that Mrs. Clinton would become president. I assumed that the forces of progressivism, not only in the United States, but around the world, would carry the day. I didn't know there would be a populist backlash. I saw that, of course, first in Toronto with Ford, and I think that was my big wake-up call. Then, of course, the Brexit in England. But then the real shock to my system and to many of us was the rise of Trump. And so I rewrote this book after the election of Trump. In the original edition, I called for a national council of cities. You could imagine that in Canada, in the United Kingdom, in my case, in the United States. That would be equivalent to the President's National Economic Council, the President's National Security Council. That would develop and bring together mayors, urban leaders, urbanists, to develop a strategy for rebuilding cities, investing in transit, investing in affordable housing. Of course, when Trump came to office and I came to realize this populist backlash, that's not the case. So what I've come to conclude, and I think it was the biggest transformation in my thinking, is just what you said. There is no one size fits all. The problems of New York or London or Paris or San Francisco, the great superstar cities, are crises of success and affordability. The crises of Birmingham and Pittsburgh and Detroit and Cleveland are crises of needing to rebuild further. The crisis of the Sunbelt city, Phoenix and Dallas and Houston, and their equivalent, is a crisis of sprawl and not enough density. So what I believe now is that these cities are equipped. They have the knowledge. They have the talent. Jane Jacobs said this. A city is built by its inhabitants, just like a great company is built by the people who make things on the factory floor. A great city is built by empowering its neighborhood residents. The problem is the cities don't have the political, economic, or fiscal tools. They don't have the budgetary tools. That's all been taken over by the nation state. That made sense for the old industrial era. That made sense for the era of the big mega corporation. That made sense for an era in which you needed a New Deal or Social Security, or needed to make sure that people, women and African Americans, minorities, gay people had certain rights. Now I think with a geographically varied economy where the situation of cities and metro areas is so different, where the clustering of activity is the key to economic growth, we need to devolve. It's very interesting that is a very active movement in the United Kingdom and in Europe. There's a big conversation about how to move power from the national government, less of a conversation in the states, but it means respecting our difference. And this is the hardest thing. For those of us, probably many Monocle listeners, we're on the progressive left. We tend to define ourselves as pretty left-leaning, at least in terms of social policy. But there are a lot of people who are much more conservative, who are worried that we are going to impose our mindset on them. That's what the populist backlash is about. So we have to understand that if people want to live, I'll call it a blue life, my life, that's okay. If people want to live a red life, we need to give them some degree, within reason, degrees of freedom. If I want to be an urbanist, I can live in a city. But if other people want to live in a suburb and drive a car, that's okay. If you want to live in a rural area and get back to nature, I'm not going to impose my values on you. We can all build, but the way to do that is to give our cities and communities the budgetary authority, take the money out of Washington, out of Ottawa, out of the capitals, move it back to the cities and give them the ability to build the way they want. And I think then we can begin to become less divided. We won't be so worried that my progressive values will be imposed on your conservative values, that your conservative values will be imposed on my progressive values. We have to reduce the stakes. If every 4 to 8 years we're going to worry about electing this president or prime minister who we disagree with, if we reduce the stakes, and most people, it's really, because I travel all to different places. I don't care where I go, Sunbelt, Frostbelt, Rust Belt, Superstar City, London, New York, Paris, Detroit, Cleveland, Phoenix. People all want to build a great city, a great community, a great suburb. I can't tell what mayor in a community is conservative or liberal, Republican or Democrat. So I think that's the way forward that this book talks about. We have to empower our cities, but we also have to respect our differences. And in that way, we get to vote with our feet. I can vote with my feet to live in the kind of place I want. You can vote with your feet, and we can respect one another. And we may not agree, but we can coexist as part of a union, if you will. That's why I think I like the phrase the United Cities or the United Communities of America. I'm an American. Sounds a lot better to me than the United States of America.
And just a final thought, staying with the glimmers of hope within the urban crisis as you describe it in your book, are there any cities, perhaps the second-tier cities, that you think actually are bucking the trends when you're doing your sort of research, that actually have found a way to sort of balance the huge boom in sort of cities, as you put it, over the past few decades, but also to the divides, the populist divides, the rural versus urban, the rich versus poor even. Is there a city that actually a major superstar city could look to on a smaller scale and say, they're doing something right?
Well, first of all, although the title may sound a little gloomy, the word crisis, I say this in the book, a crisis is a time of challenge and a time of opportunity. I'm actually very cautiously, I'm not naively optimistic that urbanism will save us, cautiously optimistic. Here's why. I think it was actually harder to get to this point. To begin, not only to bring back London to its grandeur and greatness, or New York City or Paris, they were always great cities, but to begin to rebuild Pittsburgh and Detroit and their equivalents around the world, that process is engaged. So the urban revival that's happened in the past 10 to 15 years was a really hard thing to do, and it's happening. actually to turn the switch now. And I've seen this as I've gone not just to New York and these great cities, but to these second and third tier cities, to turn the switch and engage the conversation and say we have to move from winner-take-all urbanism to urbanism, what I call urbanism for all, inclusive prosperity. We have to turn the dial and make sure that working people and less advantaged people mayors are joining, premiers, Chamber of Commerce leaders, artists, musicians, the heads of universities are joining this conversation. I think the biggest challenge is going to be the superstar cities. I'm worried. To me, and we've been talking about this, New York no longer feels the same, and I love that city. London doesn't feel – they haven't quite crossed – I say this in the book – they haven't quite crossed lost their creative edge. They're not the boring places where people are leaving, but they're tipping. They no longer have the creative energy they once had. The second and third tier cities are doing it. And I think over time, they're going to do more. I think we're getting there. Let me give you some examples. I was just in Philadelphia. It was mind-boggling what has happened in Philadelphia. I remember when Philadelphia was a bombed-out city. In fact, when the city government bombed the block, they literally bombed. It is back. It is one of the places young people are heading. They're leaving New York. Miami. We spent some of the winter there. In the Wynwood section of Miami with high-tech companies and arts organizations and creativity and people flowing in, not just from New York, but from around the world, people from Paris and London opening restaurants. So I think this is really the agenda over the next 10 to 15 years. It's to move beyond the superstar city, to move beyond the knowledge hub, to really engage a conversation about how we can create an inclusive prosperity in which not just the advantaged third, not just my so-called creative class can benefit, all residents can benefit, and the city and the suburb can be someplace that you can have a life. And I do think as soon as we got over the trauma thinking the national government would do it, that we, as you said, focus on building our cities from the bottom up, giving those cities the revenue tools, building the tools as a group of us to empower cities and their residents to do things, we can get there. But it's one of the things that worries me is there are some people in the world still saying, don't worry about it. Cities will fix themselves. London, yeah. Toronto, this is a big meme in Toronto. Yeah, Toronto's going to do it. No. If we don't figure out a way to build more housing, to build more affordable housing, to invest in transit, to really do things that we need to do to rebuild our cities, we will grow further apart. But I'm confident now, because I see this going around the country and talking to people, going around Canada, the United States, and the fall in the United Kingdom. I've never had this sense, even with rise of the creative class. I've never felt that there was more of a time to do things and build cities in a more inclusive way. So I'm cautiously optimistic. If we get our act together, if we put our nose and our arms and our legs and our backs to the grindstone, we'll get there. But it's something our cities and our communities and neighborhoods are going to have to do. No one's going to do it for us.
That was the urbanist and director of cities at the Martin Prosperity Institute at the University of Toronto, Richard Florida. And he was speaking to Monocle's Thomas Lewis. Richard's new book, The New Urban Crisis, is out now. Well, that's all we have in this week's episode of The Urbanist. Remember that you can find out more about all of our shows at monocle.com, SoundCloud, iTunes, or even Spotify. And don't forget that a brand new edition of Tall Stories, our 5-minute audio nugget, comes out this Monday too. You can subscribe to ensure that you don't miss any new episode. Today's show was produced by Carlotta Ribello. It was edited by Wei-Dong Lin and George McDonough. To play you out of this episode of The Urbanist, here's Flume featuring Beck with Tiny Cities. Thank you for listening, city lovers.
Should I find my way home? Or did I think I better go home? All I said I needed was gone.